Welcome to week 7 of wait a second, this is not American government. This is AP government. Cut. Welcome to week 7 of AP US government and politics. Have you ever wondered why Congress's approval ratings are so low amongst the American public, yet the same people keep getting reelected to Congress? Have you ever wondered why Congress spends money on really stupid things? Those are just some of the questions we'll explore this week in our more advanced look at Congress. Cue the intro. All right, that's all the time I have for an intro because we have so much to cover in this video. So let's get started. So you remember from the end of the last video, I had Bill from Capitol Hill explain how a bill becomes a law in the simplest of terms. But in AP government, there's a lot more to it than that. So we're going to take a look at more of the advanced steps into how a bill becomes a law. Step 1, a member of Congress introduces a bill to become a law. Only members of Congress can introduce bills. The president can't go into Congress and introduce a bill. Only members of Congress can. And that goes back to separation of powers, where the function of Congress and the legislative branch is to make the law. After a bill is introduced, it then is referred to a committee or perhaps multiple committees, depending on the policy area that that bill is about. As you can see on this chart here, there are lots of different committees in both the House and the Senate. And by the way, the process is the same whether you're introducing a bill in the Senate or a bill in the House of Representatives. There's pretty much a committee for just about every policy area you can possibly think of. Congressional committees is where the real work in Congress is done. Committees were created to kind of divide the workload of legislating. Now, the membership of congressional committees is determined by party leaders, and it reflects the ratio of party membership in each chamber. So, for example, if the Senate is 60% Republican and 40% Democrats, then the committee membership within each committee is going to reflect a 6-to-4 ratio. Each committee is headed by a committee chair, and they set the agenda. They're a member of the majority party, and their terms, in terms of how long they can serve as the committee chair, are limited. Now, the House committees are larger than the Senate, and that makes sense because the House of Representatives is a larger body than the Senate. They have 435 representatives, whereas the Senate only has 100. The assignments are based on constituents, fundraising ability, and party leadership. So your ability to get on maybe a high-end committee is based on those particular factors. Now, there's a handful of different types of committees. For starters, they're standing committees. These are permanent. They're divided by policy area, and that's where most of the work in Congress gets done. So, for example, the Ways and Means Committee, they often deal with taxes. The Judiciary Committee, especially in the Senate, they deal with confirmation hearings. The Budget Committee as well. So these committees will never change. They're always there because these policy areas are very, very important. Then there's joint committees, and that's where members of both chambers in the House and the Senate sit in. They focus their public attention on an issue and they gather information for Congress. Then there's conference committees, and this is also made up of members of both chambers, the House and the Senate. When there are differences between a House version of a bill and a Senate version of a bill, this is the committee that makes those changes to try to get one final draft to send back to both the House and the Senate. So this conference committee, they have to be really good at compromising and trying to take different versions of a bill and put it into one. Then there's select committees, and these are temporary, and they're normally for investigations. You might remember when President Trump was being investigated for collusion with Russia during the 2016 election, there was a select committee for the Russian investigation that was created in the House of Representatives. Here's the committee memberships for your House Representative Troy Balderson. Troy Balderson is on the following committees: the House Committee on Small Business, and that makes sense because his dad was a small business owner, the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, and the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. And that makes sense because Troy Balderson has a background being a mechanic for cars. So he is also, as you can see here, members of subcommittees. So there's even smaller committees within those larger committees that kind of help break down things further. Your senators are also on committees in the Senate. Rob Portman is a member of the Senate Committee on Finance, the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. He's a member of the Joint Economic Committee, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and all of those different subcommittees as well. Senator Sherrod Brown is on the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. He's on a lot of different subcommittees within that. He's also on the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, the Senate Committee on Finance, along with Rob Portman, and the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs as well. Obviously, towing the line and being goody-goody with the party leaders within your chamber of Congress goes a long way in figuring out which committee you're going to get placed on. But also, they try to pick things that you at least have a little bit of a background in. So after a committee or a subcommittee receives a bill, they will then hold hearings to gather information about the bill. So they'll often invite people to come in and testify and give their opinions on the bill, usually experts or people that the bill might impact in the future. After that, they then mark up the bill. This allows members to make changes to it. So maybe after seeing the original draft, they decide to cut some parts out, maybe add some parts as well. Then there's a committee report that follows the bill from the committee to the floor. So after a bill comes out of the committee, it's then introduced to the House floor or the Senate floor. And then people can analyze the bill, and then there's a debate held on the bill, a chance for the senators and members of the House of Representatives to give their opinion and their thoughts on the bill, to argue for it or against it. Now, debates in the House of Representatives work very differently than debates in the Senate do. Now, because there's 435 representatives in the House of Representatives, there's not enough time for all of them to give all of their thoughts on every bill. So debates in the House of Representatives are a lot more choppy. The Speaker of the House or whoever's filling in for the Speaker of the House will call upon someone, and usually they have about a minute to give their thoughts. Here's an example of a debate in the House of Representatives.
Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, for those with silk stockings, it's a very Merry Christmas indeed. But you get cold. The billionaires get stuffed. It's like a white elephant gift exchange. The billionaires grab the good gifts, and the leftovers go to working families, though they get the bill for everything.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Is this bill going to make life better for cops, firefighters, nurses, truck drivers, students, veterans, teachers, and
since there are far fewer senators, with only 100 being in the Senate, senators have a lot more time to speak for longer lengths of time and to really give their thoughts on the bill. And they can also pass off who is talking to one another by requesting that someone yields the floor to them.
Because of this failed economic policy, which you continue to espouse, that if we cut taxes on the rich, America is going to get wealthier. Haven't we tried it? Where are the jobs?
Could I take a little trip down memory lane with my friend from Illinois? You might recall that one of his own, then a Democrat congressman from Texas, got together with President Reagan, and guess what we did? We cut taxes, and guess what? We had one of the strongest recoveries in recent history of this country. Because, could I just say, finally, because we didn't start spending and add spending without paying for them. And I would say the senator from Illinois, he is correct. The spending that went on in the previous administration was not acceptable and led to the deficit. Let me just finish. But I would also say, speaking for myself, I voted against the Medicare Part D because it was not paid for. I voted against the earmark and pork barrel spendings, which were abundant as every appropriations bill came to the floor and dramatically increased spending in the worst way, wasteful and corrupt way, I will say. And I'm proud that at least some of us said, if you don't stop this spending and get it under control, then you're going to face a serious problem. But I would also mention, and you've seen the chart, it's gotten a lot worse. Go ahead.
I'd like to respond to my colleague through the chair, my colleague from Arizona. Does he recall what happened with the Reagan tax cuts? Because what happened was we tripled the national debt during that period of time.
So obviously the House has stricter debate rules than the Senate does. Most bills in Congress don't even survive up to the point where they get a debate. In the House of Representatives, for example, discharge petitions, which simply removes a bill out of the committee quickly, can be fashioned to a bill, and that ends up killing it. The House Rules Committee can also limit the amount of time that a bill gets by setting the rules for the debate. So the House Rules Committee is a very, very powerful committee. Of course, last week you remember learning about a filibuster, which can kill a bill unless there's cloture, which means there's 60 senators that agree to end the filibuster. Sometimes, as you will learn, it is hard to get 60 senators to agree on anything. In the Senate, there are also holds on a bill, which is where a senator raises an objection to a bill, and that can delay the bill's passage.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Reserving the right to object. This endeavor started with a resolution that the majority put forward that was intended to be a bipartisan resolution commemorating the life and service of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That follows the bipartisan tradition this body has followed, commemorating justices when they have passed. Unfortunately, the Democratic leader has put forth an amendment to turn that bipartisan resolution into a partisan resolution.
So discharge petitions, debate rules, filibusters, holds are all used by political parties to try to stop the other political party from getting something passed that they might really want. So it's really hard to even get a bill to this stage because most bills end up dying. And it's something that's been happening more and more and more the last 20 years. As Congress and the parties in Congress have become more polarized, less and less legislation is getting passed. Which I'm sure somewhere James Madison is thinking, haha, perfect. More factions, more polarization means government gets limited because it's not passing as many laws. When government doesn't get much done because the parties within government, whether it be in the executive and the legislative branch or even between houses of Congress, are constantly fighting and not allowing any legislation to get through, we often describe Congress as gridlocked. The data from political scientists seems to suggest that since World War II, bipartisanship, where both parties work together on an issue, is decreasing, and partisanship and gridlock is increasing. The parties are becoming farther and farther apart from each other ideologically, and they're working together through bipartisanship less and less and less as time goes on. So often following the debate is the vote on the legislation itself.
Ms. Hirono. No. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr.
If it ends up passing, it then goes to the conference committee. Remember, I said the conference committee is made up of members from both the House and the Senate. So the conference committee will then reconcile the differences between the two versions of the bill that might exist in the House and the Senate. When one version is created, the bill then goes back to each chamber for reconsideration. If that final version is passed by both the House of Representatives and the Senate, it then goes on to the president. And the president can either choose to sign it, in which case it becomes a law, or he can choose to veto it and reject it. Now, Congress, if you remember, can override the president's veto by a 2/3 majority vote in both houses of Congress. So before we move on, there's a couple points I want to really emphasize to you that we just went over. Number one, committees are where the real work in Congress is done. So if you contact Senator Sherrod Brown, Senator Rob Portman, or House Rep Troy Balderson about an issue that you are particularly passionate about, you want to pay close attention to the committees that they're on. Let's say you want to contact Troy Balderson and talk to him about how the highways in Ohio need more federal funding because there's lots of potholes and stuff. Well, as a member of the Transportation Committee, he could actually introduce a bill in the committee and mark it up and have a lot of say in that. But if you contact him about education and about what you're being forced to learn in school, he's probably going to redirect you to the Education Committee. Why? Well, he could introduce a bill on that particular education issue you want to talk about, but if he does that, that bill's going to immediately go to the Education Committee. Since he's not a member of that committee, he's not going to be in the room when they mark it up and they make changes to it and stuff like that. So you're going to have to rely then on other people to actually write that legislation that you want instead of your own House rep. Like I said, most bills end up dying in committee. So when Troy Balderson hands that bill off to the Education Committee, there's a good chance that thing will never see the light of day again. Or if it does, it may look completely different than what Troy originally wrote and what you originally wanted. And that leads me right into point number two. Most bills die. They do not become law. And part of that is due to partisan gridlock. The next part we're going to look at is the federal budget making process. And just like any business or individual, the federal government also has a budget where they have to pay for their expenditures throughout the year. So the federal government has to create a budget that covers their expenses for the fiscal year. And a fiscal year for the federal government runs from October through September. Their recent budgets have been in the trillions of dollars. They spend a lot of money. There's two different types of spending that the federal budget features. The first is called mandatory spending, and that's spending required by existing laws, and that is locked into the budget. So entitlement programs are the biggest part of mandatory spending. Those are programs that provide benefits for those who qualify under the law, regardless of their income. We'll talk a little bit about one of the biggest entitlement programs called Social Security. They also have to pay interest on the federal debt. We'll talk about the debt here in a little bit, but when you take out a loan to buy a house or car someday, you'll have to pay interest, and interest is a fee for borrowing money. That's how the banks or the loaning agency will get a profit. So when the federal government borrows money from other countries or even borrows money from citizens in the United States, they have to pay interest on that federal debt. That's how other countries make a profit, and that's how other individuals that loan money to the government can make a profit as well. There's also discretionary spending, and that's spending for programs and policies at the discretion of Congress and the president, meaning that this can change and fluctuate every year. In fact, some things could be totally abolished. So examples of discretionary spending would be the military, education, scientific research, and agriculture. So to sum that up, mandatory spending is spending on things that have been promised by existing law. Discretionary spending is basically stuff that has not been promised by existing law, meaning that it's at the discretion of Congress and the president if they want to pay money for it this time around or not. So who sets the federal budget? How does that whole process work? So the federal budget process involves both the president and Congress. The president submits his budget for congressional authorization. This is where basically the president lets everyone know what he wants money to be spent on. Congress then produces a budget resolution providing broad spending goals, saying, hey, here's what we want to spend money on. Appropriations committees then allocate for specific programs. Congress will then pass it, kind of like they would a bill, and then the president either signs it or rejects it. You'll find one of the biggest things that they argue about when it comes to the federal budget is Social Security. Entitlement spending is the largest piece of the budget pie, and the biggest entitlement out there is Social Security. It was created during the Great Depression in 1935 as an old age pension / insurance that would be paid for via a payroll tax. A payroll tax is basically where your company that you work for takes part of your paycheck out and it goes to Social Security. Now, the big misconception about Social Security is that that payroll tax is set aside for you. It's not. It actually goes straight to people who are retiring and need that money now. So it's designed to be self-funding, but the beneficiaries outnumber the contributors. Take a look at this population pyramid, which shows you the age distribution of the United States population. If it gets skinny down towards the bottom, well, that's partly natural because there's not as many maybe 10-year-olds as there might be people in their 30s or 40s. But if that's a continuous trend, that tells you that when that big bulk in the middle ends up retiring, there's not going to be as many people behind them paying into Social Security, paying into that big pot of cash for them to have Social Security benefits. Right now, the average Social Security benefit is about $1,500 a month. Some people completely rely on that, but it's not very much money to begin with. So the Social Security system is under severe financial stress. You can thank the boomers for being such a big generation that's all retiring at once. Thanks, boomers. Now, there have been some ideas on how to solve Social Security. One of those ideas would be raising payroll taxes, but none of us as working individuals want our taxes to go up. We want more money to be able to spend on ourselves and the things that we need. Another idea has been to raise the age to collect Social Security. But if you raise that age, you're going to make all the people that were about to start receiving Social Security checks really angry. I mean, that's not really fair to them. They spent their whole careers paying into this system, and they expected to start receiving their Social Security benefits when they reached a certain age. Who knows? Maybe they need to rely on that money. Maybe they weren't able to put much away for retirement when they were working, and now they're relying on getting that money. So it might force them to work a few more years. Another idea is to privatize the Social Security system and not leave government to do it, but instead allow people to make private accounts where private businesses and private individuals can invest in those accounts. It's a political battle that's been going on for years. Young people don't want their taxes raised, and they also are starting to realize this system may not even exist for them once they get older, and that's not really fair because they're paying into something that they're not going to get any benefit out of. But old people don't want their benefits touched because from their perspective, they've worked hard to earn those benefits, and they don't want anyone cutting their benefits or delaying when they get their benefits. So it's kind of created a political battle between younger people and older people.
I love the young people.
So if you're in Congress or you're the president and you want to make as many people happy as possible, you can't raise taxes because that'll make some people unhappy because you're taking more money out of their paychecks, and you can't cut benefits because that'll make the older people unhappy. So what do? You borrow money, because then if you borrow money, you don't have to raise taxes, but you are then paying for the benefits that people need now. So if you don't have the money to buy something now, you borrow money and you kick the can down the road and figure out how to pay for it later. There's just one problem with this. You still have to pay interest on the money you borrowed, and then your interest payments start to become a growing part of your budget as you borrow more and more money. I mean, that's less money that can be put towards the military or roads or education. As you begin to spend more and more money without having as much revenue to pay down the cost, because again, government doesn't like to raise taxes, then you create what's called a deficit. And that's again where the government spends more money than they're taking in. Over time, multiple deficits will create a national debt. And the national debt is the total amount of money you owe to other people or other nations. As you can see now, the federal government is $26 trillion in debt. At least that's right now, probably a week before you're doing this Edpuzzle when I put this together. You may want to take a look at the US debt clock now and see how much has changed in a week. I remember in high school when it was at $12 trillion. Also see there the federal deficit, which is at $3 trillion. That means we're spending $3 trillion more than we're taking in revenue. So mandatory spending and entitlements is the big bulk of the federal budget. Make sure you remember that, because that could very well be on the AP exam. In fact, there's a great game in iCivics that I'll link to in Google Classroom where you can try to manage the federal budget and you can see this all play out and see just how hard it is to manage. Now, it is possible for the government to run a surplus, but it's very rare, as you can see in this chart. Remember, a surplus is where the federal government spends less than they're taking in revenue. The last time the national debt was at zero was during Andrew Jackson's presidency in the early 19th century. Of course, Andrew Jackson didn't really have to deal with entitlement spending. Another big reason that we have such a big national debt is because of something called pork barrel spending. Trying to create a national budget means you've got a lot of things you've got to pay for, and the budget bill becomes really, really big. And that means very few people actually read through the whole thing. The federal budget also has a deadline that it needs to be passed by. Otherwise, the federal government shuts down. Now, that doesn't mean there's total anarchy and chaos. I mean, we kind of have that now anyway with the federal government being open. But it means non-essential government entities and institutions are shut down. It means things like national parks and some employees may not get paid until the federal government reopens. So the next time you hear the federal government shutting down, don't go get your Guy Fawkes mask on and go down to try to rob the local grocery store. Just remember, we live in a federal system of government, which means the state governments who have the reserve power of dealing with most crimes, they're still fully operating. But this is often used as a political tool, which you might remember happening a couple years ago, where President Trump wanted money for a border wall, but Congress refused to give it to him. Again, another example of partisan gridlock. And so the government actually shut down until Congress was able to finally get a budget. Both parties tried to blame each other for the shutdown to score political points against their opponent. So the fact that the federal budget bill is so big, no one ever reads it, and the fact that the federal budget has to be passed on a deadline or else the government shuts down means that there's a prime opportunity there for a lot of politicians that they just can't pass up. This is where a lot of politicians practice something called pork barrel spending. And it's where in that big, long budget bill, they'll slip a little clause in there that allocates money to projects within their district or their state. Now, these projects are narrow in focus, meaning it's not money for a national cause, but it's money that's given back to their state or their district, maybe to try to get him in good favor with the voters. The king of pork barrel spending was a senator by the name of Robert C. Byrd, who was the senator of West Virginia. He was notorious for putting pork barrel spending into budget bills that would give his home state of West Virginia federal money for projects. That's why if you ever travel through West Virginia today, you'll see Robert C. Byrd's name everywhere. You'll see Robert C. Byrd's name on buildings at Marshall University that he was able to help build with federal money. He got federal money for highways, roads, bridges, and dams, all of which were named after him, which was awesome because for him, that was free campaign advertising. It was a constant reminder of, hey, look who got this stuff for you. Your senator is the one who was able to get this federal money so that this could be built or improved. So pork barrel spending happens every year. Because the budget is so long and it has to be passed on a deadline, very few people ever catch these pork barrel spending clauses in the budget until after the budget's already been passed. Then there's often some senators that will publish waste books to kind of show you what the government wasted money on and what pork barrel spending there was. Perhaps one of the more recent famous examples would be when the federal government spent millions of dollars for researchers to study the sexual habits of Japanese quail while on cocaine. And I'm sure the results of that study have benefited mankind greatly. Sometimes politicians even trade votes over this kind of stuff, and it's called log rolling. Generally speaking, the public is aware of the things that Congress does, like pork barrel spending and like mismanaging the budget to where we have a huge national debt. Largely speaking, people do not approve of Congress's job performance. They always seem to have very low job approval ratings. Yet the same people get reelected to Congress just about every year. So why is that? Well, for starters, there's something called the incumbency advantage. First of all, an incumbent is a person who already inhabits the office as opposed to running for the first time. The incumbency advantage refers to the institutional advantages held by those already in office who are trying to fend off challengers in an election. This is usually greater in the House of Representatives than in the Senate. So, what factors actually create the incumbency advantage? Well, first of all, someone that's been in office for a long time has experience. They have a reputation they've built. They have expertise over time, not only on how the lawmaking process works and how to get things done, but also how to organize politically and how to use their political skills to gain an advantage. Running for Congress is also really, really expensive. The average cost of running for a seat in the House of Representatives is $500,000. The average cost for running for a seat in the Senate is $1.5 million. Incumbents typically raise more money because they have a reputation and experience. They know who to ask for money, and they know how to spend the money. They know how to effectively spend money on advertisements that show their experience and show off their position taking and their credit claiming. They can say, hey, look what I've done for you while I've been in office, just like Senator Robert C. Byrd did with pork barrel spending. Incumbents also have something called the franking privilege, and that's the free use of mail for communications with constituents. As a member of Congress, contacting your constituents through the mail is free because, after all, the U.S. Postal Service is run by Congress, and it's considered necessary for politicians to be able to communicate with the people that they represent. So they can kind of take advantage of that and get free advertising out of it. There's also something to be said for name recognition. For some people, the devil you know is better than the one you don't. And even if they're not perfect, if your life is all right, why would you change the person that's already in office now? As you're driving down the road seeing all of these political signs, you may have thought to yourself, how is putting a name on a sign an effective way to advertise for a political campaign? I mean, I'm not going to vote for that person just because I see their name on a sign, but believe it or not, repetitive name recognition does psychologically go a long way. For example, you can make some inferences about someone that's put political signs in a yard. They've probably taken a lot of time and money out to get those signs out there, and maybe that means they really want the job. And someone that's passionate about a job usually is going to do a good job doing it. There's also the element of peer pressure, where if you see a lot of signs from one particular candidate all over the place, you may assume to yourself, gosh, a lot of people must want this person elected. So I don't know, maybe I should vote for him too. Another big incumbency advantage is casework, and that's the ability to use the office to aid constituents with federal services. For example, Troy Balderson's website has a tab called Constituent Services, and you can scroll through it and see all the different things that his office can help you with. And if they help you with something, why would you vote against them if they were nice enough to help you with something? Now, one of the reasons the incumbency advantage is even greater in the House of Representatives has to do with something called redistricting. You may recall that last week you learned that every 10 years after the census, the population of a state is counted up, and then the state is divided into evenly populated districts, and each of those districts gets to send one representative to the House of Representatives. And remember also, the state legislatures are the ones that draw up all of those districts. Here's where things get tricky. Depending on which party is controlling the state legislature, they may draw the districts in a way to give their political party an advantage. Redrawing the state lines to give a particular group an advantage is called gerrymandering. There are two types of gerrymandering. The first is called partisan gerrymandering. which tries to give a certain political party an advantage. To see an example of partisan gerrymandering, we'll stay right here in our state of Ohio. Following 2010, the Republicans controlled the Ohio state legislature, so they got to draw up the congressional districts, and this is the map that they drew. Now, some of these districts naturally look weird, but that's because of population distribution. Remember, there has to be an even amount of people within each district, and sometimes the population is not distributed into nice little squares throughout the state. And remember, the population has to be the same in each district so that the weight of one person's vote in one district is about the same as the weight of everyone else's vote in all the other districts. But there's one district that looks a little extra fishy, and that's District 9, all the way up in the northern part of Ohio. You'll see that it connects two cities, Toledo and Cleveland. But those two cities are on the opposite sides of the state. So why would the Republican legislature try to combine both of those cities, or at least parts of both of those cities, into the same district? Let's think about that. Could it be that Republicans know that usually in cities, you have a high concentration of Democrats, and out in the country areas, you have a lot of Republicans. So instead of allowing the Democrats that live around the city of Toledo to filter into Northwest Ohio's farmland where there's a lot of Republicans and make a district maybe 50-50, why don't we just clump all the Democrats and put them together, and then the Republicans will have a very safe majority in the rest of these districts. And that's exactly what they did, and that's why District 9 looks so weird. Still confused? Let me try to simplify it for you. Let's say that there's a state with 50 people in it, and we have to divide these 50 people up into 5 districts with 10 people each in it. Well, within these 50 people, there's 60% of them that vote for Democrats, they're blue, and 40% of them that vote for Republicans, they're red. Well, with perfect representation, we could just draw a line straight down based off of where they are, straight down vertically, and in this case, we would have perfect representation. There's 3 blue districts and there's 2 red districts. Blue wins, but there is a majority of blue voters in the state. Another way you could draw the lines is horizontally. Well, based off of where people are, you would end up having 5 blue districts and 0 red districts. Blue would clearly have the majority in every district. So this may be compact, but it's not really fair. It doesn't really fairly represent the 40% of people that vote red. Then there's the last way we can draw this up, which is in a crazy way to give red the majority of districts, to where they have a majority in 3 districts and the blue only has a majority in 2 districts. And that's where we can focus a few districts to be almost entirely blue and then redraw the others in a way that gives red an advantage. So this is neither compact nor is it fair at all. So that's how partisan gerrymandering works. You can redraw the district lines in a state after 10 years in a way that gives a certain political party an advantage. And there's tons of examples of gerrymandered districts throughout the whole nation. Here's a map that shows you some of the more famous ones from the last few years. You can see where some other Republican legislatures tried to do the same thing and connect big cities together to lump Democrats in one big district to give Republicans safe majorities outside of the cities. There's also racial and ethnic gerrymandering. And this is where you draw the district lines to increase the likelihood of electing a member of a certain racial or ethnic group. Sometimes this creates majority-minority districts, where a majority of voters of minority ethnicity are within a district. Racial and ethnic gerrymandering can sometimes impact the idea of descriptive representation, which is the idea that Congress should really mirror the racial and ethnic makeup of the country. While Congress is increasingly becoming more and more diverse, it's still largely made up of older men who are wealthier, white, and more educated. As we close Chapter 4 on our focus on Congress, remember that members of Congress are pulled in lots of different ways when it comes to how they vote. One of the things you have to do as someone that votes for members of Congress is decide what type of role you think they should have as a representative. Do you think members of Congress should serve as more of a delegate role, where their main duty is to vote the way that their constituents want them to vote on a particular issue? The member of Congress is constantly going to have to be looking at polling data to see how their constituents are feeling about a particular issue to guide the way they vote? Or do you think members of Congress should serve more as a trustee role, which is where a member of Congress makes decisions using their own knowledge and judgment on a particular issue? That word trustee kind of implies that we, the people, the voters, are trusting them to make the best decision using the information and knowledge that they have. Then there's the Politico role, which emphasizes that Congress is a politicized body. Members of Congress have to balance their choices with the interest of not only their constituents, but also their political party and what the party leaders want. Hopefully, if we get to do a congressional simulation in the spring, you'll have a chance to decide what type of a role you would take on as a representative in Congress. Whew, that was a lot, I know. And chapter 4 in the textbook probably dumps more content on you than any other chapter in the rest of the text. Don't worry, some of this stuff is going to pop back up in other chapters we go over too. So for your assignments this week, obviously this Ed puzzle, and then you have 2 required Supreme Court case videos that are in perusal. Shaw versus Reno and Baker versus Carr. Both of those cases have to do with redistricting and voting. So make sure, just like we did with our 2 previous Supreme Court cases you need to know, make sure that you annotate those videos and understand those cases very well. And lastly, make sure you finish outlining the rest of chapter 4, sections 3 through section 6. Typically, when I go through chapter 4, I stop and spend a couple days playing some really cool online games that go hand in hand with the content. The People's Pie on iCivics and the redistricting game. So I'm going to post a link to those games in Google Classroom. And you know what? I decided to attach a bonus opportunity with it as well. If you play those games and follow the instructions in there, I have a way for you to earn some potential bonus points. So keep an eye out for that in Google Classroom. And I really encourage you to play them, even if you don't want the bonus points, which can't imagine why you wouldn't. They're still really fun games to play, and they really do help you understand some of the content in this chapter a little bit better. One last announcement: the last day to turn in any missing assignments you have from the first 9 weeks or any extra credit opportunities is going to be this Friday, October 9th. So make sure you have any missing assignments or any extra credit you want to do in by then, because I won't accept it after October 9th. As always, let me know if you need anything, and have a great week.